extend this argument to show how such unravelings alter the lived, material, and remembered dimensions of more than human place. So on Pappy, this unravelling is inseparable from biological extraction, the violent removal of the orc into the distant confines of a natural history collection. This has cast a long shadow over the island, becoming entangled in its cultural memory and its heritage. And it is in relation to Pappy, as a place reconfigured by this process, that my artwork takes shape. So the locale now occupied by the King of the Axe is far removed from the exposure-blackened cliffs of Pappy, a metal cabinet in an offshoot of the Natural History Museum in Tring, just outside London. This is a space which is pulled through the orc's presence into connective resonance with the island. But it also holds another aspect of the orc's lingering materiality. And that materiality is a collection of great orc eggs, of which the museum holds 6 of the 80 or so that remain worldwide. Each of these eggs is cream-coloured, as you can see, but is otherwise unique. Each is a different size, shape, and has diverse patterns marking its surfaces. These patterns are unique to the female bird that laid them and enabled them to recognize their eggs within densely packed social colonies. The markings are produced from pigments formed in that individual bird's blood and bile, and are a bodily echo of that bird's ecological context, given that particular foods absorbed tend to transform an organism's being, blurring the boundaries between a body and its environment. But when I asked the curator in charge of these eggs' care about these markings, he tells me that they are not stable and they are now very faded and bear very little resemblance to their past vibrancy, and could be said to be now fading records of lost orc life worlds. It was an encounter with these eggs that prompted the material process I want to turn to in the remainder of this talk. Looking at them again, I want to point to the other marks that also now dot their surfaces. Penciled initials, names, dates of ownership, catalogue marks, Linnaean descriptors. These too are marks of biography, mingling with and to an extent overwriting the fading marks left by the anonymous female orcs, tying the eggs instead to the narratives and identities of particular egg collectors, collections, and institutions. Eggshell here becomes a sort of palimpsest where later writing overwrites previous meaning. Instead of speaking of animal individuality or ecological life world, the shells now also reveal the process of possession and assimilation through which they have been transformed via a succession of owners from lively vessels with the potential of becoming animal into objects of natural history knowledge. Returning to Pappy, I'm once again holding in my hand one of my replica orc eggs, but the location has changed, and I'm now in the island darkroom. In near darkness, lit only by a red safe light, I coat their surfaces with photographic emulsion, a light-sensitive suspension of silver halides used in analog photography to coat paper and other surfaces for printing. Using a pipette, I dribble, blot, and scrape the emulsion across the surfaces, mimicking the patterns I observed in the museum. Once they've all been coated, the eggs were transported by boat to the Holm, which, if you'll remember, is the possible site of one of the orcs' former breeding colonies. Here, they were left to expose on the island in specially made pinhole cameras for a duration of 42 days. That's one of the pinhole cameras on the right, made from an old paint tin. So 42 days is an estimation of the bird's old incubation period, and they were exposed at a time that coincides with when the birds once came ashore to breed. During this time, the eggs darken before I develop and fix them back in place in the darkroom. So my photographic here draws on the work of Roland Barthes and his reflections on photography and mourning. In Camera Lucida, Barthes describes how photographs remind us of what we have lost, often returning the dead to us. He refers to this process as the punctum of the photographic image and describes how the incidental details they capture, a face or a still gesture, often rise from a scene to bruise us, reminding us of the ongoing passage of time and the pain caused from losing something irreplaceable. Crucially for my own work, Barth also begins to articulate an understanding of how the base chemical elements of analog photography are just as important in this as the representational element of the process. The action of light, he writes, by which the photograph is born on the level of sprouting silver grains. As I mark the surfaces of my eggs, I do so with Barth in mind, moving away from photography's representational prowess and towards this kind of emotive abstraction. Here it is not representation that holds the emotional pinprick of the that has been, but the light-sensitive silver halides that underlie the image. The marks on my eggs are not representations, they are patterns that refer to the orcs, that attempt to remember or cite them, both in and through place, but that ultimately reveal only the inaccessibility of their former life worlds here, their otherness, the uniqueness of their species being, and how all of these irreplaceable things are now absent. But as well as invoking absence, this process of making this artwork and situating it in place does something else. It undertakes what I call a practice of creative repatriation, offering a partial material return of an extinct species or an locally extinct species to the place from which it has become estranged. In this case, the replica eggs that I made were exhibited on Pappy in the Kelp store, the island's heritage centre, with a number remaining there as part of its permanent collection. Now, unlike conventional repatriation, which focuses on the return of human remains or cultural artifacts, this practice works through material citation rather than restitution. It does not seek to undo extraction, but to reckon with its afterlives. By returning the eggs to Pappy and allowing them to site as closely as possible the orc Spanish life worlds, the work reconnects these material remains to the island, allowing the extinct birds to persist and to continue to matter within the ongoing emergence of more than human place. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Milo.
You're welcome.
Very moving. Now we come to Cole Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Just give me 1 second while I cue this up. Can you hear me okay? All good?
Yes.
Lovely. Okay, I'd like to thank everybody for the invitation and your audience. I'm going to pack this 15 minutes, so let's get going. I'm Cole Swanson. I'm an artist and PhD candidate at York University in Environmental Studies, and today I'm going to talk to you about cormorants, art science research, and environmental monitoring and materials. So in 2015 to 17, the US Army Corps took over the cormorant monitoring research infrastructure on East Sand Island, killing over 5,500 double-crested cormorants in apparent defense of the salmon population in the Columbia River. Retrofitted science monitoring architectures were transformed into platforms for sharpshooting birds by night. The Army used camera traps to monitor the impacts of their kills, and they bulldozed hundreds of nests into the water. Then one day, every single cormorant left. The largest colony in North America collapsed. The birds relocated to the Astoria-Megler Bridge with catastrophic results. Their acidic guano compromised the structural capacity of the bridge, and they started to cause car accidents. It was kind of a mess. 10 years on, efforts have been made to relocate the cormorants back to their original nesting grounds. It was called one of the great episodes of wildlife mismanagement of the last half century. The truth is that cormorants have been known as the world's most persecuted birds. They're an ancient species group, present throughout the world. They're highly adaptable organisms to fresh and marine water environments. But throughout history, they've been implicated in a series of extraction projects, including the harvesting of their guano for fertilizer and local river fishing traditions in China and Japan. Conversely, they've been blamed for damage to property, the death of trees, and losses in commercial fish stocks, which are circulated by mainstream media and political agencies looking to eradicate them. In essence, they're imagined as competition for our dominance over natural resources, and in more nefarious situations, they have been remade into enemies of the state. These biases are very old. They're even biblically associated with gluttony, filth, and evil. And among other more repugnant monikers, they're named the devil bird after Satan himself. So in 2020, the Conservative government of Ontario passed an unprecedented open season authorizing the public to exterminate substantial numbers of the native species while permitting their bodies to spoil. This is a call that's unsubstantiated by science and was motivated by political lobbying groups like the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. Cormorants were extirpated pretty much in the 1950s from DDT exposure, and their comeback, which is a conservation success story in the 90s, is somewhat to be blamed for people thinking that they're invasive. And so there's a hate-based campaign that has been carried out by specific members of the public, mostly rural white men who are out to kill them. There's a military aesthetic at play in the common discourse around cormorants, as if we're at war with them. Local men congratulate each other for killing large numbers of birds, mostly juveniles, by saying thank you for your service. Cormorants might be considered the resistance simply because they fight for the right to live together, to take up space. Very little is known about double-crested cormorants in relation to other earthly assemblages, and while most discourses on the colonial waterbirds emerged through settler capitalist regimes seeking political gains, land ownership, and resource extraction, these things are bolstered by ancient and modern biases. Their pest status has effectively dislocated the birds from their ecological networks. Now, I'm engaged in a long-term art science collaboration with Dr. Gail Fraser, who is a behavioral ecologist and cormorant researcher and a professor in environmental studies at York University. Together, we are attempting to explore questions that exist outside of the mainstream media and the extraction politics that have so far defined what a cormorant is to the rest of us. And we're doing these experiments in consideration of the more dynamic lives of specific cormorants and their kin through place-based research. So this is where our research is situated. We're on Lake Ontario in the city of Toronto. It is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewas, and Wendat First Nations. And this is Leslie Street Spit, or what's known as Tommy Thompson Park. It's a fascinating 5-kilometer landmass that is made mostly of dredged sediment and anthropogenic debris. So it was a landform that was built to support a perceived increase in cargo shipping in the 50s, which ended up not happening, and has since become an environmental hotspot. So it's sort of a special place in Toronto. It also happens to be the home of the largest colony of double-crested cormorants in North America. Each year since 2008, Gail Fraser visits the ground nesting colony to monitor nest success, and that means counting chicks from a sample of nests adjacent to this makeshift blind structure of her own design. And every year, in around late March, cormorants return en masse from the Gulf of Mexico to breed. So Gail does weekly visits from the blind from May to July, and participates in a long-term quantitative monitoring project that is based in live observation and the use of specific monitoring tools and technologies. And look at how amazing that is, by the way. I met Gail in 2017 when I was doing a land use art project in partnership with the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, who oversees the site. And they introduced me to her. That year, after the birds had left for winter migration, she took me on a walk. And I was already kind of like enamored with the constitution of the site. Being a material artist, there was something very strange about the whole place. But I was even more surprised at the plethora of anthropogenic debris that had made its way into the ecology of the space. One of many reasons why people have cited cormorants as being such a problem is that death is an obvious fact of life in the colony. It's an aesthetic problem, in a manner of speaking, because it's a multi-sensory onslaught that reminds us that some biological systems will defy our preferences for what nature should look or even smell like. Gail and I first bonded over trash. And so one of the things that was really interesting is that I had noticed this massive collection of materials and had even suspected that there was a color code at play. And so examining nests and their contents led us to develop something of a performative art experiment around the idea of trash. In particular, we were interested in whether or not birds were collecting materials that were blue and yellow. And the reason for that, as you can see in this photo, is that during breeding season, double-crested cormorants get this beautiful cerulean blue mouth, and their cheeks turn tangerine yellow. And so we wondered whether or not this had something to do with sexual selection. So we did two experiments. The first one was fairly simple. I had just pre-colored tongue depressors, and then we preloaded them into sample nests within our research site to see whether or not the cormorants were privileging those nests over others when they were selecting nests at the beginning of the breeding season. And then the other one, which is a little bit more complicated, involved sampling anthropogenic materials, so human-made materials from nests that were stick-like in form, trimming them to even size and recoloring them into groups. This is kind of like a science experiment meets performance art project. I would put these colors out in this lure-like form, and I would hide in a little duck blind, and I would watch to see if the cormorants engage with specific colors over others. We also use trail cameras often for most of our research. And what was fascinating about it was despite our multi-year deployment of these, they were both inconclusive experiments. I think it's tempting to think that birds like cormorants can be so easily known and so predictable in their behaviors, but instead these experiments showed that there's a variety of dynamic interactions that happen within our experiments that exposed us to a more nuanced understanding of life in the colony. So rather than attempting to flatten cormorants into some sort of factual or consistent set of behaviors, the experiments opened up other possible ways of knowing with the birds. And I'm just reminded of this quote by Vincent Despret, who says that they're experiments of invention. The dispositive does not determine the behavior that is acquired, rather it creates the occasion for it. So we kept experimenting. Most of what we were able to work with in the research site were actually what we call conservation surveillance technologies. These are technologies that are commonly used in environmental monitoring, and there are benefits to them. In particular, we use things like, I'm just going to play the video while I talk. We use things like remote cameras so that we can capture more intimate views of life and look at interspecies interactions at a distance. Those are those bright blue mouths and showing them off to each other. It's quite lovely. And when we think about conservation surveillance technologies, it might benefit us to sort of take a more critical look. So I'm reminded of the usefulness of this quote by William Cochrane, who was an engineer in science monitoring technologies early on. He said that the history of science often follows the instrumentation. And so conservation surveillance technologies do a lot of good things. They create obvious distance between researchers and subjects and mitigate disruptions. They can provide scalable and remotely accessible data for global distribution and obvious opportunities for public engagement like citizen science and education. But on a critical look, it's worth considering how the quantitative data that is produced through such technologies have a tendency to flatten individual organisms into data points, and also erase the agency and ecological effects of human researchers and their systemic progenitors. There is a tendency now to use such technologies to remake animals into commodities, which has the effect of disconnecting subjects from their ecological networks. The more we know quantitatively and the more we share in a scalable way, the more we attempt to know them in a flattened way. And when that is appropriated unethically, they become killable. There are some material transformations that also happen in the site, and that's something I'm particularly interested in as an artist. I'm reminded that these tech tools and technologies are developed by the state for military projects and risk reproducing the systems which threaten the very species that we study. And so even when the military isn't directly involved in conservation research, as they were in East Sand Island, its energies circulate the field. The same cameras are used for species eradication programs, including those which recruit members of the public to track and identify species branded for death. And with this hardware, any average Joe can basically pretend that they are a special agent in the armed forces. There's kind of like a recruitment aesthetic kind of happening through the marketing and distribution of these materials. So given our imbrication with this sort of violent state-driven extraction system that would eradicate cormorants at certain points in time and place, there's an opportunity here for us to engage in a more reflexive form of ecological monitoring. And this involves a series of techno-scientific and methodological subversions that work within the dominant research system, but consider more seriously the materiality and the ecological agency of these technologies and our research practices, and their effects, in the ecosystems within which we work. And so the question is like, how do we engage in ecological monitoring in a more just way? And there's just a list here of the conservation surveillance technologies that are used currently on the SPED. One of the obvious ways to do this was to just be in the blind differently. And so I started to engage in slow media like drawing, writing poetic text, writing reflections, and using image capture devices to capture something other than quantitative data. And at one point, I started to think about how the blind itself is an opportunity for us to monitor ourselves and our situatedness and our agency in the site. And so I rigged the blind with trail cameras. And what was particularly interesting about doing that is not only did we see ourselves researching cormorants, but we captured imagery of a family of raccoons that had made a home in the blind. And that helped us understand the massive drop in nest success that had happened in that year. It was 2023. And it turned out that it was the blind that was also providing a habitat for one of the key predators of the species. Beyond staging trail cameras in the interior of the colony, we started to spread them around. So I started moving them through the blind and moving them to the perimeter of the colony with Gale, which gave us a bit of an eye on emerging predator dynamics, if we want to call it that. So we were tracking coyotes and raccoons. But really what we were also getting was this wonderful view of multi-species life. And in some cases, like direct material interaction between these species and the cameras themselves. At one point, we were forced to embrace the element of disruption or change to our cameras. And so a cormorant had knocked one of our trail cameras off focus toward the edge of the colony and instead captured this beautiful and dynamic view of the birds woken up in the middle of the night with some sort of predator or threat outside of the frame. This concept of surrendering, which Rangan calls the cinema of surrender, gives the agents in the ecology opportunity to shift perspective in meaningful ways. The fact is that every tool implicated in research is ecologically responsible for transformations in the field, and trail cameras themselves become colonized by insects and covered in guano and exposed to the elements. To reorient one's focus on such materiality opens a deepened understanding of the web of life. Research events are ecologically transformative, and attending to this through artistic subversion of research tools provides a lens provides a less abstracted view of the specific ecologies that we're studying, and instead engages with actors of all kinds, including multiple species, the weather, atmosphere, human researchers, and a myriad of unrecognized agents in the field. And this is like a stop motion video that was created from stitching together these tunnel cameras. The artworks in progress that I'm developing or attempting to take seriously our presence and agency in the contact zone that we study in. And I'm reflecting on my own relationship with the material ecological constitution of the site, as well as the historicity of research methods and tools from within which we build our respective practices in science and art. I recognize that there are paradoxes in this work of protection and management, of care and control. And what you're seeing here is actually a drone capture above the nesting colony. So this is several thousand nests in Peninsula B where we conduct our research. And if you look really closely, you can see Gail and I wearing this camo costumery that I created as a part of this work that I think explores the tension that is inherent in the practice of environmental research and monitoring. One of those tensions is that the site itself is hostile to our bodies. Like our bodies are inherently vulnerable to a lot of things. I mean, it's physically dangerous to walk there. There's the threat of avian influenza in the air. The organisms that have recreated that ecology have recreated it not for us, which is something that's really fascinating to think about while you're doing that work. And cormorant colonies in general resist us in many ways, biologically, aesthetically, philosophically. And therefore, we are transformed significantly when we engage with them. Finally, the artworks that I'm developing for exhibition and defense of my PhD will attempt to unfold the paradoxes explored here. So they are based in creative relations with the material ecological dimensions of research practices, both scientific and artistic, as well as the cultural and political forces that shape both the collective imaginaries of cormorants and life on the ground. There's also a sacredness to being in the space, to being in relation with its constituents, and the work that goes unexplored in the literatures. Like there's much that is not written about, and I think that that's what an artistic science collaborative practice can bring to the fore. Ultimately, the cormorant is not really the sole subject of the work, but provides us with an entry point to better understanding the complexity of ecological emergence and how we find ourselves within it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cole. That was really fascinating and a lot to take in too.
I know it's a lot to present.
Okay, so now we're gonna move on to Sam.
Just doing that. Sorry, just bear with us while we sort out the PowerPoint. It never wants to share the first time round. Let me try again. Da, 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 da. Yes. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for that lovely introduction earlier, Raquel, and thank you to Milo and to Cole as well for your fabulous talks. So in this talk, I'm going to be exploring what it means to draw on more than human ontologies through material and discursive creative practice. I will explore methodologies for collaborative and redistributive storytelling inspired by fungal decomposition, developed through my own and collaborative artistic practice of collage. I want to ask, how does the more than human help process and circulate narratives? How can we approach toxic discourses, break them down and draw strength from them? And what must we decreate to recreate? Those are some of the things I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm drawing on my doctoral research on environmental and specifically fungal monstrosity in speculative fiction. And in my thesis, I asked, how do monsters tell environmental stories? Or what do monstrous representations in speculative fiction and culture reveal about our relationship with our bodies and the ecologies around us? In my thesis, I define environmental monsters as ambiguous representations of human and more than human mixture that elicit feelings of fear, disgust, and desire. I drew on a range of environmental and monster theorists to get to this point, from Donna Haraway to Stacey Alimo, through to eco-Gothic scholarship, which looks at the way that Gothic shapes environmental knowledge through dark narratives and aesthetics. For example, when real environmental catastrophe is portrayed as monstrous. I just wanted to share this example here because it speaks to these themes quite succinctly. This is an example of an experiment done by Aurélien Soucy, who fed the IPCC climate change report into generative AI, and the images that it spits out are definitively very Gothically coded. On the flip side, environmental catastrophe shapes our understanding of Gothic and horror. So we've got examples like Godzilla, Annihilation, Day of the Triffids, and they encapsulate fears around nuclear radiation, genetically modified crops, and oil spills. So this subdiscipline of eco-Gothic has important environmental humanities functions, helps us to recognize violent logics of othering. It reveals anxieties about mixture and purity, talks about the workings of power on our bodies, the valorization and demonization of people, places, and more than human beings and ecologies. These cultural representations help shape real-world value attributions, whether economic, political, or societal, which affects decisions about any number of environmental and bodily realities, such as where to build extractive infrastructure, where and how to dispose of waste, and what to focus conservation efforts on. I could go on, and I can talk about it more in the Q&A, but it's not the main focus of my talk today. But the environmental humanities functions of the eco-Gothic I described earlier are kind of equally relevant and unpacked by the practice of collage. Collage makes monstrous bodies. In my research, I looked at lots of examples of environmental monstrosity in speculative fiction. There's some on the screen. And a lot of these monsters talked about the toxicity in the environment, pollution, global warming, extraction. But the environmental monster I kept coming back to was fungi. So Sam Solomon, Natalie Cesare, and others have described the mycelial turn that has been unfolding over the last decade or so as the way new or mainstreamified knowledge about fungi and their strange ontologies and different ways of being are feeding into popular consciousness and academic research. This is definitely the case in the eco-Gothic imagination, and speculative narratives have been mushrooming all over the place in genre fiction, film, TV, and games. Here are some examples of some speculative novels featuring monstrous fungi mushrooming all over the screen. Monstrous fungi encode all sorts of eco-Gothic meanings, including anxieties about death, decay, and rot, but also the fixity of the human category, the porosity of the body, more than human agency, leaching as it always does from anthropocentric dominance, the ownership of our own minds, thoughts, and ideas, and the fraught pleasures of more than human entanglement. So in my thesis, I distinguished between monstrous fungi, fungal monsters, fungal monstrosity, and fungal eco-monstrosity. And I'm not going to go into all of the distinctions here, but in brief, monstrous fungi are defined as, in my thesis, as fungi represented as monstrous. So too big, too slimy, too quick, too dangerous, too poisonous. And fungal monsters, we can see here from The Last of Us, are characters of human and fungal entanglement kind of amplified to monstrous degree. Fungal eco-monstrosity, again, I'm not going to touch on too much, but talks about thinking about sort of increased scales of monstrous entanglement in the Anthropocene. But today I want to focus on fungal monstrosity, which is the ontologies or capabilities of fungi made monstrous. So these ontologies include fungal capabilities of decay and decomposition, the infection of the mind or body, spores as reproductive mechanism and as transmitters of knowledge, memory, communication, hunger, mutability, agency, parasitism, and symbiosis. In the text I analysed in my thesis, the speculative eco-Gothic mode and narrative explored the implications and ramifications of pushing these ontologies to the monstrous extreme. A monster, after all, is always unignorable, a forcible apprehension of a disturbing truth. So today I want to focus on the ontologies of decay and decomposition, which links to hunger. I had fun with the with the animations on the slides today. And I'm talking about them sort of made metaphoric through monstrous representation. I'm going to give a brief textual example and then talk about how I've used my kind of creative practice of collage to explore the fungal ontology of decomposition. What do I mean by decay and decomposition? I'm specifically talking about saprotrophic fungi, which break down organic matter and more than human bodies, especially plant bodies, and circulate the nutrients through ecologies once more. Take bracket fungi, for example. Sandra Lawrence tells us that bracket fungi are hugely important for the planet, as they're the only organisms, one of the only organisms, that can break down the lignin, the tough, woody compounds in trees. By decomposing the lignin, the fungus makes nutrients previously locked up available for other organisms to feed on. We see it as rot, but without it, the planet would be littered with dead matter. So in mycophilic scientific communities, this gets everyone very excited about mycoremediation, which is the concerted use of fungal decomposing enzymes to clean up Anthropocenic mess, pollutions and toxins from the ecologies. Again, I can touch on more of that in the Q&A. But it also has potent metaphoric potential. So I'll just move this so you guys can see the quotes. For example, in Sorrowland by River Solomon, the protagonist Vern is a fungal monster. I'm defining a fungal and human entangled figure, and she has a polypore fungus which grows out of her back and restructures her body, breaks down her bones and redistributes them around her in a hard chitinous skeleton. And there's a really lovely piece of fan art here from Layla Rose. The novels take the ontology of fungal decomposition, of saprotrophic nutrient cycling, and make it monstrous by applying it to the human body. So this is the speculative mode, which forces us as readers to consider what it might mean to decompose and recycle nutrients. The result is something for Vern that looks like a teratoma. It breaks down her bones and redistributes them around her body in a kind of protective exoskeleton that literally shields her at the end of the novel. Vern's fungus also works in a more kind of traditionally fungal way. It helps her decompose trees and organic matter in order to feed herself. So I'm just going to read this quote here. She's sort of feeding mycelially, lying on the forest floor at this point. So tendrils of invisible mycelial thread prickled her. She could see the whole shape of its body, her body. She was as big as the continent, the earth. Vern ate with her skin. Mycelia from the dirt traversed the mycelia of her body and fed her the ground. She absorbed broken down trees, logs, and animal remains into her cells, and for the first time in months, her hunger was sated. Vern's fungus also works to decompose metaphorically, to break down the trauma, pain, and violence, what I call the tough compounds, to echo Sandra Lawrence, of the past, in order to draw strength from them for future resistance. This trauma in the classic Gothic mode comes in the form of ghosts called hauntings, which are kind of violent poltergeists who attack Vern and embody the general trauma of Black experience in this speculative world. The novel's kind of meant to be set in a near future of the US, but I don't really think the future has anything to do with it. So Vern learns to break down the toughness of these hauntings, take what is good from them, and uses it to feed this army of resistance at the end of the novel. So this speculative example got me thinking about the metaphorical power of decomposition and nutrient cycling when it comes to narrative and storytelling itself, especially in the context of discourse and how it shapes material reality, and vice versa. we have all of this ecological toxicity and all of this discursive toxicity with narratives of monstrosity, which valorizes and demonizes both people, places, and beings, informing both. And then this got me thinking about the sort of kind of metaphorical or discursive mycoremediation of drawing on fungal ontologies of decomposition as a way to process toxic discourse, to break down tough compounds and perhaps recirculate their nutrients back into storytelling ecologies. So I've been kind of playing with that idea, both in my own artistic practice and in my sort of teaching and facilitation work. I've been making collages for about 8 years, and it sort of struck me that collaging is a lot like fungal decomposition, breaking things down and recycling the components into something new. I've used collage in various projects in this way, with museums to engage with the processes of storytelling using materials from the past. So this was a project called Wasting Time, funded by the Brigstow Institute here at Bristol, about storytelling in the Anthropocene, and we ran a workshop where we used the idea of Bristol blue glass to kind of collect up the more than human lives and bodies that get wasted in industrial and extractive processes, but more broadly thinking about sort of history and context, what lasts, perhaps broken down and recycled in different forms, and what gets forgotten. We also did a collaborative project with my friend Emma, who's in the room as well, at the Museum of English Rural Life at the University of Reading. And we ran a sort of public collage workshop to think about kind of pollution as it moves through farmland and body manipulation of kind of chemicals that are used in agriculture, and how these toxins fed through the landscape sort of collect in and transform bodies in monstrous ways. I've used my collage with my sustainable development students to get them to think about pollution, novel entities, and geochemical flows, but more broadly to encourage creative storytelling, consider context, break down knowledge silos by literally moving things around and reflecting on the construction of knowledge through contrasts, patterns, and different aesthetics. But I also think collage can encourage critical thinking, and return narrative agency for the participants as well. You know, it's collaborative, it's enjoyable, it's fun, it's low risk. It can help the students engage with, process, break down, and rework tough material. So Sandor Ellis Katz, I've got a quote here on the slide, says something similar about another fungal process, fermentation, basically a more appetizing word for rot, as a metaphor for critical thinking, something that interrogates the substrate of foundational ideas and reworks them into something new. And I think collage as a more than human material creative discursive practice, say that after a few pints, does something similar. I've since repeated this collage workshop with some different groups of students and other public workshops. So these are some collages, I've got the sort of permission of all the participants to share these works anonymously. These are collages made by students of the Environmental Humanities Summer School here at Bristol, with the kind of same pollution theme as the sustainable development students explore in their workshop. The school is also running again this year, but I think Andy's maybe going to share some details about that after the talk. Another collaborative partner of mine also ran a workshop in Edinburgh for the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities called Spring into Methods. So this was thinking about Gothic and liminal spaces and sort of collage as a speculative tool. I should say that these workshops all came before I started thinking about collage and decomposition and as decomposition and nutrient cycling. It was in fact through these instances, these different workshops, of breaking things down, circulating them, and rebuilding the picture in the way that I wanted, and forcing others to do the same, maybe coercing them, infecting them, like a zombie fungus, by making these brief collaborative storytelling networks. Whilst thinking about fungi, this is when it all clicked. I was becoming fungal, and I was making other people become fungal as well. So Kylie Crane describes she talks about thinking fungi and talks about how other fungal ontologies, like the zombie ant phenomenon, has become a cultural analogy applied to a biological phenomenon, which goes in both directions. An example of potent metaphorical and material transfers between the natural and the cultural sphere. And that's kind of how I'm thinking about fungal decomposition and collage. So last week at the Eco Horror Symposium, Nature Bites Back was the first time I kind of presented collage in this sort of explicitly fungal way as a cultural analogy to the biological phenomenon of fungal decomposition, and asking the participants to think of mycoremediation as a metaphor for processing toxic discourse. So I brought some toxic discourses, which you can see on the left, to the workshop for my collaborative fungal network to break down and recycle, perhaps drawing more nutritive stories from their toxins. I haven't yet had time to kind of fully analyze the products and maybe evaluate how toxic or harmful discourses have been recycled into new narratives. And I don't yet know whether there is any sort of radical political potential in that. I'm not sure yet whether telling people they are acting like fungi adds anything to collaging, which doesn't really need any theory to be enjoyable or to create thoughtful or beautiful art. It's literally cutting and sticking. But the workshop did provide people with a space to be creative together, and it did allow people to discuss the narratives that the toxic discourses brought up and to share stories of their own traumas. Maybe it helped some people break down some of the toxins in their life. Either way, I heard from across the board that, if nothing else, it was just really cathartic to cut up the Daily Mail. Thank you very much. I just wanted to end with a bit of shameless self-promotion. This is my book here on the left with a QR to buy it. And I'm also giving a talk on the history of folk horror next month in London and online. And the other QR code is for that as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sam. That was very inspiring. Well, now we'll give everyone a moment to gather your thoughts and maybe formulate some questions, which you can post on the Q&A chat. And I would like to invite Andy Flack to share with us a little bit about the Environmental Humanities Summer School hosted by the University of Bristol.
Is he here? If he's not here, I can share the details. Oh, he is there. Sorry. Oh, he's got his hand up. Yeah. Allowed to talk.
Here I am. Sorry, I am here. Hey. I couldn't work out how to make my voice actually work. Here we are. Okay. So, can I start?
Yeah.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Sorry, I'm having issues with technology. I apologise. So yes, the Environmental Humanities Summer School started last year. So it was the first year that it ran last July. And it's run by the University of Bristol and hosted by our Centre for Environmental Humanities in collaboration with Bristol Global Summer, which is the kind of organisation that, or part of the university that runs our kind of summer international opportunities. So we had students come to us. There were about 15 from all over the world to spend 3 weeks with us, learning kind of some of the fundamentals about environmental humanities. 1 or 2 had done it before, but most students who came had never encountered it, but they were working with environmental studies, themes and topics in other disciplines. So what we had over those 3 weeks was a set of conversations based around particular themes that really kind of consciously introduced kind of key ideas in the environmental humanities and encouraged conversation that crossed those disciplines. So we really kind of activated those different expertise, different perspectives to, I suppose, to really highlight what it is that environmental humanities can bring to those big global challenges that people are encountering in all sorts of disciplinary areas. Classes were taught by members of faculty, our PhD students, our teachers, and it was a really diverse program ranging from a kind of class on taxidermied animals through to kind of collage. Sam run a session or two or three or four, I think, for us in the end. Milo, who you've heard from as well, taught a session as well. I taught a session on my own research around darkness. It was a really diverse and really interesting program, and there were also lots of different field trips interspersed through the 3 weeks as well. So that we went to Westonbirt Arboretum, which is our national arboretum, or one of our national arboretums, to learn about plants and kind of plant humanities stuff. We went to Bristol Zoo to think about captivity and kind of the exotic in terms of kind of human animal studies. We also did a few kind of walks around Bristol, including a deep time walk. And then there were other trips as well run by the university more centrally. So trips to Bath, to Oxford, to Stonehenge, to London. So it's a really, students found it to be a really rich experience, both intellectually, but also in terms of kind of making new connections, new friendships, connections with kind of other researchers, wherever they be and whatever they're doing. So if this sounds like something you'd be interested in, then do look it up. You can write to me if you would like more information about this, either for yourself or for your students. I'm not running it this year, sadly, but I can then direct you to the two colleagues in the Centre for Environmental Humanities who are taking the lead on this for summer 26. There we are. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
I'm going to invite everyone again to post their questions in the Q&A box. And if you'd like to ask your question aloud, let us know and we can enable your sound. And I also want to invite the panelists, if they want to ask questions to each other to start. That'd be great.
I wrote down loads of things. What were some of the questions I had? I have to say, I had lots of questions for you as well, Milo. But Cole, I loved the opening of the cormorants as sort of like guano as resistance. You know, they all went to this. What was the bridge again?
The Astoria Megler Bridge. This is like,
yeah.
It's a bridge over a smaller river that leads into a town not that far from where they were originally chased off. And even though it's not an ideal habitat for them, there is something really profound about realizing that cormorants will do everything in their control to live together, even if it means facing like imminent threats at every turn. And so in some ways, I think of them as resistors, because they're resisting. I suppose like if being shot at by the army wasn't enough to split them up into smaller groups, they're like actively mobilizing the takeover of other environments and doing it at great risk to themselves. So there's something really poignant about that.
Yeah, definitely. I was thinking like, lots of monsterizing narratives and discourse like shaping that. So that's a cormorant on the tree in the Garden of Gethsemane?
Yeah. So in Milton's Paradise Lost, Satan cloaks himself as a cormorant. And he looks over, I think, in the Bible, there's some reference to cormorants being the evil birds watching over Nineveh. And then, of course, in the painting that I shared, it's over the Garden of Gethsemane. And so you have this sort of very old Christian symbol that travels through time. And I think what's really interesting, because I had so much to pack in this talk, I don't really get to talk about some of the amazing sort of symbolic or representational issues of the Cormorant story. But one of them is that there are biases that run the course of centuries, and they are constantly transforming and adapting to new possible conflicts with humans. And so, they were devil birds before, but now they're being called other things. And a lot of the stuff that they're being called is indicative of, contemporary, I would say, like issues around ethno-cultural relations. And like one of the nicknames that's been coming out recently is China Loon, which is something that's happening in Ontario where people are blaming them for COVID. So during COVID, there's this kind of this sort of conversation that COVID came from China, and because they fish with
Yeah.
cormorants in China, cormorants obviously brought COVID with them. And so they're kind of blamed for everything, and they have a new name. Like the idea of naming or renaming them is actually quite potent because it just sort of helps you track the sociological discontents. And then the willingness to put them onto this animal that is a scapegoat. Somehow by killing them, we're solving these problems, which is obviously not the case. So
Yeah. Yeah, and that makes sense with the kind of like the sort of the older associations of them as devil birds. And then I thought it was really interesting what you were saying about like the water birds sort of kind of coming up in or like how they were thought in those sort of like early colonial landscapes, and obviously like how that's affecting and sort of still being perpetuated now, and how that being kind of vilified as sort of like the devil in the garden, if we think of North America as a colonial landscape with the so
we
much.
have so much overlap in our research, actually.
Yeah.
It's their liminal sort of status, right? Like that they're somewhere between land and
Yeah.
sky and bird and water. And that, across mythologies, they're sort of like at the precipice of life and death. And they're sort of involved in these landscapes that are so-called natural and so-called human. Like I think it's that sort of liminal status that makes them monsters. And
Yeah.
I'm quite curious about, I guess like I was listening to both of your presentations and resonating quite powerfully. One of the things that I wanted to ask Sam if I could, or not Sam, Milo, sorry, Sam's name is on the screen. Uh, is this idea of memory? Like I was fascinated by your application of analog photographic media to the eggs, and the desire to, I think, maybe conjure back, or at least like participate in memory through action, and creating these patterns on the eggs. And I wondered whether or not, like, if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on how like a material art practice and memory are entwined in the work that you're doing.
Sure, yeah, I can give it a go. So, I guess to begin with, the orcs used to, like many birds, probably like the cormorants that you work with, and like many of the other seabirds on Papi, they return to the same place every year as close as they can get, um, in order to breed. And kind of in my thesis, I wrote about this a little bit as a kind of a sense of belonging, a remembered belonging that's associated with a particular place that, in the case of some of Papi's other seabirds, gets disrupted, much in the same way as with your cormorant. So when the bird's memory or sense of belonging to a particular place is violently disrupted, they often shift a locale, and that, for me, disturbs kind of this kind of inherited sense of belonging that you can kind of find, or at least I found resonance with when I was interviewing islanders about avian absence, and they would describe like the Arctic terns return to the island every year as this sort of it related to their sense of belonging to the island. They recall specific life events around whether or not the terns were there, how they first arrived on the island, and remembering the birds arriving, how the volume of birds made their sense of place special, how it led them to stay in that particular place. And so I kind of speculatively, like, I guess with a bit of generosity of spirit, expand kind of what I consider to be meaningful memories when I reflect on my own life. And it's kind of nice to think that other animals, other organisms, plants, materials, they all have perhaps not a similar memory, but kind of a similar sense of meaning that develops through kind of a temporal being. And so, yeah, attributing memory to the eggs, I guess what I was looking at with the markings was trying to like reconnect this kind of temporal incubational time back into place. And there's no way of recovering the memory of like the orc's presence there. Like I was struck when I was listening to your talk and you were describing the sensorial overload of the bird colony, and having experienced something like that with other species of bird, and just trying to imagine what that would have been like visiting an orc colony. And I guess the version of memory in my work is a very sanitized version of what I might imagine like that orc colony to have been like. So in a sense, it's a false memory, but yeah, one that I'm very interested in kind of reattaching to place. Like those rhythms of more than human lives and reconnecting with them. That's something that gets lost through time, I think, once a species becomes absent in that particular place.
I had a question on the back of that, actually. I wanted to ask about, I was really struck when you were talking about the orc eggs. And you had a really lovely phrase of the bodily echo, like the markings on the eggs being a bodily echo of like the biological contents of the birds. And I was thinking about your use of light to kind of evoke those patterns on the egg. And I wanted to ask why you chose light. I know you're thinking about sort of art and memory and sort of photography. But I was thinking, because you're thinking about, you know, sort of the situation of those eggs in like the more than human place. Did you ever think or experiment with like, yeah, any other techniques or?
I didn't. And, you know, to go into that in a little bit more detail, I trained as a photographer, and I don't know if it's the same for you, Cole, but you kind of have specific materials and ways of thinking through materials that you come back to. And
yeah,
I've kind of not done so much photography for a while, but I've always been really interested, not in photography as a kind of representational tool, but about photography as this kind of way of recording duration. So photographic exposure is always a period of time that's recorded onto a surface. In a different way to, say, a cinema film or an animation, where you get a series of images, one after another, that create an illusion of time, whereas photographic exposure actually records what happens during that period of time. And we're so used to thinking of photographs as like these instant things, because they so often are, like the cameras, lenses, films, whatever. So like good nowadays that you always get this static moment. And
that makes sense.
I've been thinking about duration, the duration of incubation for a long time, and about trying to register what that was like, and the idea of eggs as these really poignant symbols in the context of extinction, where it's like this vessel holding the next generation, and extinction is the collapse of generation. And so I was kind of gathering all of these things into my head, and I think probably in a similar creative way to you as with your collage. It just kind of all sits in there, and then stuff just comes out, and you don't necessarily know what you're doing, but something sticks, and then you kind of go with the process and see where it takes you. So that's
definitely. Yeah, you're all sort of working within the mediums that we tend to work with.
We do have some questions from people online that I want to bring. There's first a comment from Francis that it was very cathartic to cut up the Daily Mail, and thank you. Sam, in your Nature Bites back talk, you casually mentioned that mushrooms, specifically their lignum digesting qualities, led to the end of fossil fuels forming. Is that really the case, or did I misunderstand, oversimplify?
Who was that? Who's asking that question?
Francis. Who thank you for cutting up the Daily Mail. Francis.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Thank you for that question. So fungi you didn't misremember. That did happen. So during the Carboniferous period, when the sort of organic matter and plant matter was, you know, dying and collapsing and not decomposing, but sort of lying on top of one another and sort of forming and compressing into oil. What kind of ended that period was the fungi at the time developing an enzyme that could decompose the lignin in wood. So yeah, that was a quote from that book, Let's Become Fungal, where she talks about, again, sort of like with generosity of spirit and sort of thinking about fungi and a sort of drawing on them sort of and drawing sort of metaphoric meaning from the way that they behave. The idea that they kind of like brought the end of the future fossil fuel industries because they literally stopped oil production way back when oil was sort of first forming. And that author, Yasmin Ostendorf Rodriguez, talks about, yeah, sort of talking about them as sort of like the first sort of like eco-activists in that sense, like the first sort of like Extinction Rebellion activists, because they like stopped oil production all of those years ago. But yeah, that was, you remembered correctly. Thank you for coming to the other talk.
Thank you. And I have another question from for Sam from Mosa McNeely. You shared an image from a book by Black speculative fiction author River Solomon of the protagonist with a fungal growth coming out of her back. You also made mention of narratives of Blackness in relation to the theme of fungal monstrosity, if I remember correctly. I would be very interested to hear more about what you have found in your research centering this in relation to fungal monstrosity, collage, and or speculative fiction.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, so the sort of broader my broader thesis looks at fungal monstrosity over lots of different speculative fiction, sort of historical and contemporary, focusing on kind of contemporary fiction. And a lot of the other novels that I was looking at were written by white authors, and a lot of the older fiction was written by white men, and a lot of the kind of aesthetics, the dominant aesthetics of fungal monstrosity in like H.P. Lovecraft and Arthur Machen, and yeah, a lot of the kind of like older weird writers, a lot of the aesthetics that were coming out of that were, and thinking about sort of fungi as monstrous and the aesthetics that they were kind of using to describe them was the idea of them as being like slimy or mushy, and this kind of anxiety around like the fixity of the human category and the sort of the fear of that kind of dissolving into like the muck and mire of the wider ecology and earth. And some of those aesthetics are kind of dominant in a lot of the contemporary works as well, and including in works by other brown and black authors. So Mexican Gothic by Marina Garcia, Silvia Marina Garcia, she uses that sort of same, she's drawing on kind of weird fiction and weird horror, and the aesthetics of fungal monstrosity from those kind of old weird masters. And again, she kind of deploys that sort of aesthetics of sliminess and mushiness and sort of rot as being scary because it's going to like dissolve our bodies into like the earth. And then that's why I found River Solomon's novel and the aesthetics that they deploy, or Faye deploy, so interesting for lots of different reasons, but because they're specifically writing about Black experience and sort of histories of white supremacy and presence and futures of white supremacy and sort of Black resistance to them, and using fungal monstrosity as like a speculative mode to explore that. That's why I thought the kind of aesthetic changes in how they're describing and sort of presenting fungal monstrosity were so interesting, because it's not mushy. You know, we have this sort of fungal monster in the character of Vern, and she's not like dissolving into the earth and like freaking out about it. You know, she has this, you know, she's got this polypore fungus that kind of grows out of her back, and it draws these nutrients out of her bones and then uses that to make this really hard exoskeleton, this made of chitin, which is the substance that a lot of fungi are made from, but also like the exoskeletons of insects. And I just thought that was really interesting because she's drawing on, Solomon's drawing on like a different aesthetics, like an aesthetics of protection for the Black character within the novel to sort of protect herself from the violence of white supremacy through like a hard fungal exterior rather than like a mushy one. So yeah, that's what I thought was really interesting about that novel. It's a fabulous book. I mean, it's really, I've literally pulled out one tiny thread, but it's very rich and complex, and Solomon tells many, many stories in it, and the kind of fungal decomposition aspect is just like one small part. So I would encourage the kind of... Thank you for that question.
Thank you, Sam. Anyone else have any questions? Live from where you guys are at?
We've got one in the room here.
Yeah, we've got a question.
Yeah, thank you everyone for those wonderful talks. I had a question for Milo actually, around fragility, both sort of like material fragility and sort of if that relates to sort of fragility of species. I was thinking in particular of eggs as things which is almost meant to break, and how that played into your creation of representational eggs that were then meant to not break and like stay the course. So yeah, sorry.
Sure, yeah. So yeah, you're right. Eggs are very much meant to be broken open to allow the life that's to be inside them to come out. But with my eggs, I was half interested in the great auk's eggs themselves as like the vessels of potential animal that I discussed in my talk, but also I was interested in what an egg becomes when that meaning or that sense of the egg is removed by the collector, and it is removed from that kind of that sort of temporality and placed into a very different one inside a natural history collection, where that temporality it doesn't have that meaning anymore. It's designed to be stable, this object that lasts, in the case of some of the eggs in the Natural History Museum, 300, 400 years plus. So I guess my version of the egg is very much, it's playing with that kind of the temporalities of that museum-based egg. Like this is a meaningful object in the context of generations, like they break open and new life comes out, but they're also these objects that symbolize like the odd shift in temporality that happens when those items become valued for something else. And kind of I was working with that kind of idea of like material transformation, I guess, and meaningful transformation. So yeah, my eggs aren't really meant to break, but I did break quite a few in the process of making them. Quite a few got broken while they were in the pinhole cameras, and me dropping them afterwards. A few on the train on the way back from Orkney got crushed. But yeah.
I had a question about your eggs as well.
Yeah.
So because I was thinking as well, like, because also there's I wanted to ask, did you make do any of the eggs that are in the collections, have they been x-rayed, and do they have embryos inside them?
Yeah, so yeah, none of them do. So eggs, once they've been collected by the collectors, they're always blown.
Ah, I see.
Yeah. So they've got that little hole inside.
Yeah.
And then
I think Kate wanted to ask a question as well.
Yeah.
Only if you're finished with the eggs.
Sorry, I just had one tiny other question. And this is also for kind of Cole as well, because you're both working with birds. And I was thinking about you making eggs. Did you think about, I don't really know how to phrase this, but I was thinking of you thinking about extinct female birds laying eggs, and then did you think about gender or reproductivity of yourself as like an artist making eggs?
I did a little bit.
Yeah.
After I'd made all the eggs and they were on the island, I became
like
really interested in like this kind of incubational time, and like what my role was. And I would walk to the shoreline every day and look across the sea with my binoculars to check how they were all doing. But yeah, I did think about that. Yeah.
And then I was thinking with you as well, Cole, is that on the poster for this talk, is that you in a bird costume? I was thinking about both of you as kind of like role playing as bird.
It was an older piece. I didn't really have a chance to weave it in. The thing is, this project has been going on for like 10 years, so there's a ton of artwork, that some of it more successful than others. That piece was called Spit Spectre, which was actually an early like performance project, I guess, where I was collecting anthropogenic materials in the same way that the birds were collecting anthropogenic materials. So it was partly like kind of a living piece where I'm gathering this matter in my life and this alongside them gathering similar matter and then creating a kind of like a hybrid form that's sort of a ghillie suit. Because I think about camouflage a lot, because it's kind of inherent part of the process of doing this research is, we call it a blind, even though it's like totally obvious. It's like the birds know we're there. They it's actually there are all these ironies, right? Like in sort of like we row up in a little canoe and then we kind of crawl through and they're watching us the entire time and then we're sitting there and they're watching us the entire time. And so I started to think about that, partly that there was this like really obvious visual presence of these human materials in the site, and that birds are exercising some kind of curatorial agency, even though we don't really understand it. I think my early experiments were attempting to simplify that, like, oh, their mouths are blue, so they like blue. They're much more complicated than that. But there is this kind of obvious, like almost monstrous kind of quality to the site where you have these petrochemical objects which cormorants, I didn't get into it much, but they were pretty much extirpated in the 50s. So if you imagine like this really ancient bird doesn't encounter any material like that at all. And then they almost all disappear. And they come back in the 90s and 2000s, and the world is a totally different place. It's full of all of this brightly colored matter. And blue pigment is super rare in nature. So for them, who have like perform this kind of blue and yellow this show for each other every year, it seemed to me just like obvious that they were attracted to these materials for their color. But it's fascinating. Like when I first made that piece, the performance was more or less me reckoning with like the material presence of these new objects in the colony site and their longevity. And so in the work, I'm kind of walking the perimeter of the colony in an endless loop. Um, but later projects kind of moved, I think, into a more nuanced direction where it wasn't so much just about the color or the form or even just being there on the site. It was more like taking really seriously like the really rich and dynamic diversity of materials that constitute that ecology. And like I've discovered a lot of very funny and unpredictable things. Like cormorants love tennis balls. I have no idea why. They have no function that I can tell in nest building, but they're totally collecting like scores of tennis balls, and they love sunglasses and they love toothbrushes. So there's this like whole there's just some opportunity to, I think, speculatively engage with the site, knowing that we'll never quite understand what's going on, but that our worlds are linked. And the piece that I had showed toward the end, which is that drone shot of Gail and I in camo, is actually the two of us repatriating a lot of these materials from nests in order to kind of and on the one hand, like recognize our own sort of relationship with these materials in their former lives, and then also kind of participating in something of a like, it's kind of a tricky thing, but it's not great that they have these materials in their nests, right? Like these are dangerous materials too. So there's some like tension there, like should we be removing them and bringing them back into our world, and in what form? Or should we just be leaving them and letting these birds continue to evolve their own relationships with them? So yeah, that's a very long and meandering answer, but I could talk for days about that stuff. It's
And
so
actually,
fascinating.
me and my colleague Lexi Angela have been thinking of doing or trying to figure out a project with collage and trash and litter in spaces. So we should talk.
Yeah, we should talk. Actually, there's some ambition to make assemblages of some of this material that is a little bit more high risk for their well-being. And so I'm working through several of these projects now. Everything I showed today, for the most part, is an experiment. It's not quite there yet, but I have the next year to figure it out.
We've come to pass our time, but I was just wondering if we can have one last question from Kate, if you are okay with that.
I'm also happy to cede the floor if there's someone else who has a question. Okay, I get to ask it. That was a perfect segue, Cole. Thank you. Thank you all for really fascinating presentations. I'm now, well, I'll just ask the question. I was struck by the fact that all three of your talks involve ways of thinking through art to respond to the lives and particularly the afterlives of things in the Anthropocene. So it really was a perfect segue. But each of them had a very different. I responded to them emotionally very differently. So there, like Raquel, I really found the material artifacts of the eggs extraordinarily moving. The palimpsest of different lives writing on the eggs, and then their recreation. I love the idea that that's sort of a form of occitation happening in the processing of the created eggs. I loved the sort of the different ways in which trash is involved in it is the spit, it is the stuff that the ox are using. You're using the repurposed blind. And then the raccoons are also using the repurposed blind for for their own ends. And then the collage work is sort of a decomposition and recomposition of both material things and also ideologically toxic things. But they all respond, but I responded to them emotionally very differently. And I'm wondering if I could ask each of you to speak about your thinking about the affective qualities of the material objects and processes that you've engaged in. I felt sad. I felt melancholic. I felt, yeah, go for it, cormorants. I felt, and I felt sort of a mucky joy in the idea, cutting up the Daily Mail, but also the sort of the ways in which fungal metaphor can sort of do decompositional and recompositional work with toxic narratives. So could you talk about emotion and feeling and affect in your work? That was a long way of asking that question. Sorry.
No, it was lovely. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to go first if Cole is.
No, please.
Yeah. So I guess looking at all three of our talks and the different approaches to material, I think an important difference for me is is probably time again. So I think both you, Sam, and you, Cole, are working with quite current contemporary ecologies that have all of these novel materials in them, and I think you were hinting towards that a minute ago, Cole, that have quite a kind of, well, for me, a very bodily resonance. Like seeing all the trash, I feel a bit disgusted. I feel grossed out. I feel like, ugh. But when I'm looking at like the historic material that I was working with on Pappy, it's very different. It's this kind of elegiac feeling of looking back at this material that's from a time where before all of this existed, and it's kind of it's a very different feeling. There is this sense of fragility, this sense of guess, to use the horrible word, this naturalness in the material that I was kind of drawn towards, that made me feel quite that I wanted to kind of replicate as much as I could in my work. But obviously I'm using materials in my work that are very different to that. Like I use a gypsum plaster that has this extractive background to it that's hidden in the work that I make. And the photographic processes itself that use chemicals and materials that have this kind of toxic background to them that you, as an artist, you kind of try and reduce through good practice, but that are still there. So there's this kind of, I don't know how to say it, but this kind of the tossing up of like being drawn towards these materials and using them, and this kind of disquiet about their material lengths. yeah, I guess that's my response to that.
Fabulous. Shall I go next, Cole, or do you want to jump off
Sure, I'll jump in.
that?
My answer is as complicated as everything I've been talking about is because I feel a gamut of emotions when I'm doing this work, and that's probably why I've been doing it for so many years. At first, like the scenario that brought me to want to study cormorants was motivated by a kind of outrage for their very public vilification, and so there was like a I don't know, an impulse in me to sort of assume an advocacy role, and that was bolstered by like, yeah, like outrage. Um, but once I started to actually go there, I realized that I was like just as much a part of the same systems that are producing the scenario where these birds are also sort of being objectified and therefore like eradicated. So there's kind of an uneasiness to a lot of it, actually. I'm starting to write right now in earnest on this, and how I feel exhilarated, but that exhilaration is informed by a lot of very contrary kinds of emotions. It's like excitement to be able to do this work that I've always kind of wanted to do because originally I was going to be a zoologist, and then switch to art, and now I'm sort of doing everything I wanted to do. So there's like excitement there. But there's also an obvious like empathy that sort of settles in, like a sensorial, like interspecies form of empathy where I feel their distress at my just being there. And so that makes me feel accountable and sometimes guilty. But then once, I'm sort of settled in place, particularly like and engaging like in a bit of a routine where the animals have because they're so adaptable, have like habituated to my being there and us being there. There are these moments of like awe and almost spiritual. There are spiritual moments in this work that I'm also going to explore because I feel deeply connected to a much longer temporality in being in their proximity. So yes, to your point, Milo, like this is a very contemporary situation materially to be in, but these animals are like 30 million years old, maybe even 60 million years old. And so like I feel connected to a much longer timeline and not necessarily in a romantic way, but just in sort of like in recognizing the feeling of both connection and otherness that comes out of being in relation to each other physically. I keep reminding myself that we're amniotes. So I love that you're talking about eggs because like the egg is actually kind of the thing that brings us together. We have a common ancestor and it's built around what we call the amniote, which is like the egg that is in both humans and birds. And so yeah, it's like a complicated emotional and affective roller coaster to be doing the work. And I think partly that's the point of engaging in an art practice like this is to be able to unfold sometimes these contrary forms of experience into artworks that deepen or complicate the way that we might think about it. And hopefully that, patrons who experience the artworks can receive that in a number of ways. So that's a very long answer. It's complicated. That's the answer.
It's complicated. I'll just speak very quickly. I think, yeah, similar sort of roller coasters of different emotions that come up. Yeah, when I'm reading about sort of or thinking about collage in a sort of as a sort of like fungal metaphor to kind of like break down toxicity and kind of redistribute or draw strength from what we can, I feel like, yeah, empowered and sort of like angry at the toxic discourses and ecologies that we're sort of surrounded with, but also kind of buoyed to do something that we've, yeah, kind of all talked a little bit about that kind of the sort of empowerment and anger and of the kind of this kind of work engaging with more than humans through materials. When I facilitate workshops where I invite other people to do collage, it's always really joyful and exciting, and I always leave feeling really energized, just to sort of people rise to it very quickly, and they get stuck in immediately, and I really like the kind of accessibility of that kind of like collaborative creative space. And I literally do it whenever I can, like in every teaching or workshop that I run. So there's a lot of joy there. about sort of the ease of creativity, and especially for, you know, where I've worked with science students where, you know, there's no sort of technical ability necessary. It's literally sort of quite playful and, you know, childlike, just to sort of cut things up and rearrange them. There's lots of joy there. I will say I feel in terms of, and I'm sort of at the beginning of starting to think about this in a kind of fungal way. I'm at the beginning of thinking through the collage I've been doing for a long while and thinking about it through the kind of fungal metaphors that I've been looking at in my other sort of speculative research. So at the minute, it feels quite divorced from sort of the materiality of sort of fungi out in the world. So it'd be interesting to think more about where this might go in terms of, yeah, inviting fungi into the college. I don't know, but yeah, I feel like the sort of me at home and us in sort of the classroom, sort of thinking about fungi and cutting things up, and then the sort of like the fungi in the world kind of doing that work. And I haven't quite figured out the relationship sort of between them yet, but so tentative excitement is there as well, I suppose. We should probably finish that already.
Thank you. Thank you guys for all your amazing insights and for the opportunity to engage with these incredibly inspiring themes. I'm going to invite everyone to come to our next session, which is April 15th, with the theme Thinking with, in, as water. So we hope to see you all there. Thank you.
Thank you all.
You as well. Yes.